Welcome to the Feeling Loudly podcast, a show about human emotion and the way we navigate this life of trials and triggers and treasures with the help of astrology and tarot. I'm your host, Jana. I'm an astrologer, a tarot reader, and an Akashic Records reader, and I'm here to help you do this messy life with as much grace, ease, and pleasure as possible. Happy Devil Day! Welcome to day 16 of the 22 days of tarot. I almost went, I'm your host, but I forgot that I have an introduction on this podcast, so there's no need. Cool. So the Devil is a complex card, and it's one that I was nervous about, honestly. I was going into today and frankly the next few days here just feeling a little and because I know the majors and I know the progression, and so I can't really hold myself back from starting to think about what the next card of the day is. And because this journey has been so synchronistic so far, that means that when we go into the heavier material, sometimes heavier stuff comes up. And like that's what happened with Death Day and with a couple of the other earlier archetypes. But also the beauty of this journey is that it's been unexpected. And there have been cards like the Devil today that have given me unexpected blessings and awareness and didn't feel as challenging as I expected them to. And there have been really cards that I associate with loveliness that have been challenging and have brought up tough stuff. And that's kind of just a great example of how the majors are not black and white. They're nuanced, and there is light and challenge with like every single archetype. And there's ways that they can be expressed in really beautiful and delicious ways and in not so easy ways. And so today was a good day. It was a good day, and I actually felt like I was able to practice self-restraint, and I did kind of fall into some habits that are a little bit old for me that were, not the best. Like I scrolled on TikTok for a really long time and then was like, damn, I just lost like an hour and a half. But I'm a human. And part of devil work for me is actually overcoming or like easing at least the really, really rigid, cruel voice in my head that is partly, in large part, like capitalism, like enforced capitalism and productivity. And on the other hand, and informed by that, is my childhood abuse and experiences of being like really constantly criticized and judged and all of that stuff and bullied. And so there's that stuff that is honestly a product of the culture that we grew up in and exist in. And for me, this journey today was a lot about recognition of how I've divested from parts of that and just how far I've come in my healing, that I'm able to be soft with myself. That's been such a long healing path for me, is that softness and that kindness and that self-compassion, and to not kind of like beat myself down when I mess up or when I miss a day of my routine or when I just show signs of being human. And so that like flexibility and the ability to not go 110% on something came through bright and early. In my yoga class this morning, the instructor was actually talking about that. And then just like throughout the day, I kind of, there were things that I didn't do and things that maybe I accomplished late or just felt like I wasn't quite vibing, and it was okay. And our prompt of the day today was, what have I achieved? And at first I sort of like prickled at that question, and then I remembered writing it and being like, ha ha ha, like this is kind of a trick question in some ways, because I wonder if people will kind of recognize that it's kind of an egoic question. Not that achievement is like ego based per se, but the striving can definitely be, and it can be a means for approval, whether that's from other people or ourselves. And it can be a way of sort of abandoning ourselves so that we hit a mark and so that we hit a milestone or accomplish some type of goal. But at the same time, like, goals are beautiful and they help us make progress and grow. And there's very real, like, benefits to that we can't ignore. It keeps us moving. It keeps us going. And so because today is our lunar eclipse in Libra, our South Node lunar eclipse, full moon in Libra, again, it's interesting to have this synchronicity. I didn't realize this when I first laid out the challenge that the devil would be falling on this day, but it's pretty perfect because this is a lunation that's very much about balance and about striking some degree of balance and easing up in some area of our life that's needing a little bit more flexibility while also coming into stronger boundaries where they're needed. Not people pleasing, but also, yeah, not people pleasing. And part of that is like people pleasing ourselves. Like, I kind of see when I slip into habits that are really not good for me, I kind of see that as like people pleasing with myself. Like, there's a part of me that really wants something and I'll just be like, yeah, yeah, go ahead, go ahead. And other parts that are like wanting to resist and wanting to impose some degree of restraint and self-discipline. But then they'll sort of like back down in the face of a part of me that feels really hungry, that feels like it's really wanting something. And that sort of wanting is very devil. The devil is about attachment. It's often about addiction and behaviors and desires that can feel more compulsive and intense and sort of grabbing. And as someone who comes from a long lineage of addicts and alcoholics and folks who've dealt with various types of addictions, and as someone who's struggled with, some forms of addiction myself, like especially screen addiction, I guess, I've dealt with codependency, and in college I had a binge drinking problem, and I've had like various compulsive habits throughout my life that have been really hard for me to kick. And my, like, if I were to go like get a psych eval, they would tell me that I had OCD, like, for sure, or at least previously would have. It's really, really, really lessened in the past year or so, and maybe like year and a half, but especially in the last 6 months. And the last 6 months in particular, because of where these eclipses are hitting my chart, Libra is primarily my sixth house. And that's a house of habits and work. And like workaholism has been a problem in my past too, overworking myself, pushing myself to extremes, neglecting other parts of my life. And that's something that in the last 6 months has really, really evolved for me, as has my boundaries around my daily rituals and my habits and my routines. Like, just 6 months ago, I was in a really like not great place in terms of mental health. Again, it was the fall. Like, I've mentioned on the podcast before that I was kind of like, I was like shoveling like imagery and videos out of Gaza, like, into my spirit in a way that was unsustainable for me. And it, paired with just other stuff that was going on in my life, became really hard to like function. And I was staying up till like 3 a.m. some nights, just sort of obsessively consuming content. And it was really tough because I had also just moved to a new city where I didn't know like anyone. And so my whole life was sort of revolving around like me and my phone and my friends who live in different places. And it just like was the perfect recipe to like send me into that sort of mental health spiral. And I'm not saying that this compares in any way to what's happening in this world, but it's just the experience that I had. And so I had to back away and create some boundaries for myself because I wasn't able to work really. I wasn't taking great care of my dog. I was taking really poor care of myself. And I had to learn again how to like fill up my own cup and resource myself and connect with people who could help meet my emotional needs and my relational needs and sometimes practical needs. And that sort of like reaching out for connection and support and community was a really important shift for me. And because, again, the South Node's been traveling through my sixth house, it's been really kind of digging up this material that needed to be looked at and needed to change. And my North Node, or the North Node traveling through my 12th house, is what really pointed me toward reconnecting with my guides and reconnecting to my spiritual practices that are really life sustaining for me as a 12th house sun and Mercury. And it was over the course of the last 6 months that I redeveloped a morning ritual. And you've heard me talk about this. I've talked about it a lot on the podcast, and it's often something I mention at the very beginning. Like, so here's what happened in my ritual. And like, I kind of wondered if that felt strange to anyone that I focus so much on it, but it's because it's something that's really meaningful to me. As a sixth house Pluto in Scorpio in the house system that I use, that's been a really sore spot for me since I was a child because I grew up in a custody battle and my parents were never married. And so when I was born, I almost immediately, not quite immediately, they lived together shortly just kind of for practicality purposes, but they weren't together. And so I was switching back and forth between parents from the time I was very young. And it was very volatile. And so my dad, like, and my mom were just had a horrific relationship. And so there was a lot of turmoil. And my mom being a single mom of 3 kids, me and my 2 older brothers, half brothers, and my dad being this sort of like bachelor who never wanted a child. And like in some ways, not in some ways, I very much felt like I had kind of ruined his life, or that's at least the sort of like sentiment that was not so indirectly expressed at various points growing up. And so this feeling of being a burden was very loud for me as a kid. And it occurred in both homes just in different ways. At my dad's, it was that he was this single guy who wanted a life. He wanted to be an actor. He had big dreams and like was a stunt coordinator and wanted to direct films and like get into the film industry and had these dreams. And then he had this child and you know, my dad is a very complicated person and he's not a particularly stable person. He has and had a lot of mental health issues and things that I didn't quite understand when I was a kid because it was just me and him. And he did what he could. And I've come a long way in terms of like coming to peace with that. And although we're not in contact because it's just not okay for me, I've developed a lot more empathy and I'm able to have a lot more empathy and compassion for him in his absence. And when I'm in contact with him, I'm not able to have that. And that to me is also devil work. Like the setting of boundaries and the recognition that sometimes we need to love someone from afar and we can only really heal when we're not enmeshed with someone who, especially if they've been abusive or harmful to us in some way, or if the relationship itself is just not healthy for us. And that's something I've really traveled through a lot of different chapters of my life in terms of like setting limits and boundaries with people who I genuinely love, but who we can't be in each other's lives for a variety of reasons. And my dad was the first big one. My dad was the first major cutoff, and it allowed me to be bolder and more courageous about ending relationships when I knew that they needed to end, as opposed to waiting years and years and years until I lost myself in them. And that was really pivotal. And, you know, it wasn't like a linear process. I went in and out of it. I went back into contact with him. I went out of contact with him. But it's been a long time since we've spoken, and I I'm able to love him because I'm not in contact with him. I'm able to have compassion for him. And that comes with a lot of grief. You know, it's strange to grieve someone who's still alive. It's strange to grieve a parent who's still alive and to grieve that relationship. But it's also been very heart opening for me in some ways and has really kind of expanded my capacity for compassion because my dad was very abusive. And and much of, like, kind of getting back on track here, much of the sixth house Pluto stuff that I'm talking about with the devil is that because I was switching back and forth between homes, my schedule was really kind of all over the place. Like, I would go between my dad's, where like there wasn't really any structure except in martial arts, where I was training like really, really rigorously. But then outside of that practice, there wasn't structure. Like, our sleep schedules were kind of all over the place. He was pretty lax. And then over at my mom was much more like rigid in day-to-day life, but then like lax about like my free time and play. And I lived in a community where I had friends and where I went to school. Whereas with my dad, I was pretty isolated and it was like just us two and then going to the karate school. And so it was really strange, like a very strange back and forth that was punctuated by these like horrific fights that they would get in, and by going to like court for like custody stuff and talking to lawyers and talking to child psychologists. And so, like, a really strange feeling of being observed and being sort of like analyzed by everyone. And it made me very like hyper vigilant and hyper aware of myself to the point of exhaustion. And that sort of self-regulation and self-moderation bled into the rest of my life. And so up until really, again, like the last like year and a half, maybe a little longer, maybe like after my Saturn return is when it really started easing up, and when I started doing more intensive trauma therapy during my Saturn return and leading up to it is when a lot of that material came up to the surface. And then I was able to release a lot of it and to start building different ways of relating to myself. And so, so ritual is important to me because in a way it's a reclamation. It's not in a way, it is. It's a reclamation for me of my autonomy. And it's part of why I prefer to work for myself, because I have trouble like being on someone else's schedule. My like little protective inner rebel will really, really kick up in those situations, although that has eased up too. But like that's part of the reason that full-time work has been challenging for me for a long time, is that this part of me would get really sort of protective of myself as soon as I felt like I was being hyper managed. And it fluctuated based on the job and based on like how rigid the environment was and all of that. And some was easier than others. But essentially, like, this devil work for me today has been a reflection on all of that and on the ways that I've healed. And that's really beautiful because that's not what I was expecting. I was expecting it to be kind of challenging and like sticky. And there was some stuff that came up around attachment, but for the most part, it felt easeful. And when I looked at this portals card, I saw this skull with a crown on it being burned, like a human skull transposed on top of a bonfire. And it just, to me, was like, this is like the breakdown of these internalized authoritarian views and beliefs and internalized capitalism. Not that all of that's gone by any means, but a lot of it is. And it's me kind of setting that on fire, like laying it to rest, laying this like this not matriarch, that's not what I meant at all, laying this like patriarchal figure of authority and punishment on the fire and letting that go. And I loved that. And then I pulled a couple oracle cards and got Nirvana, which in this modern oracle or modern Nirvana oracle is a really lovely deck, and it talks about how Nirvana is about quenching or blowing out, and it's about really releasing attachments. And there's an exercise in here that's kind of beautiful, and I'm going to read it aloud in case anyone wants to do this. So I'll share the prompts, and you can follow along if you wish, or you can just fast forward if you're not interested. So step 1, close your eyes and take an extended inhale through your nose. As you inhale, visualize any moments in life where you may have been greedy, possessive, or deeply attached to a particular object or sensory experience. Visualize this feeling as a fire in your mind's eye. Strongly exhale through your mouth like you're blowing out a candle. Visualize the fire being put out with your breath as you extinguish that energy and allow all residue to evaporate away from your life force. Take another elongated inhale through your nose. As you inhale, visualize any moments where you may have been ignorant, judgmental, or extremely attached to an idea. Visualize these moments as a fire in your mind's eye. Strongly exhale through your mouth like you're blowing out a candle. Visualize the fire being put out with your breath as you extinguish those moments and allow the residue to evaporate away from your life force. Take one more deep inhale through your nose. As you inhale, visualize any moments in life where you may have held anger, hostility, or resentment toward another person, place, or experience. Visualize these emotions as a fire in your mind's eye. Strongly exhale through your mouth like you're blowing out a candle. Visualize the fire being put out with your breath as you extinguish those emotions and allow the residue to evaporate away from your life force. Open your eyes and take note of your feelings. And there is a mantra here, if you would like to repeat it aloud with me. It goes, I am light, but my fire does not burn. I maintain grace as the wheels of karma turn. Nirvana is my goal every day on this path. And I understand that my impact, not this vessel, is what's here to last. So I thought that was really cool, alongside the imagery from the card with the skull on fire and the devil being all about attachments, and this exercise being very much about releasing attachments, especially to difficult emotions like resentment and like the stuff that I was talking about with my dad. And that's not something that I've really put together with this card before, is how it can be connected to the release of emotions that we're attached to also. And that makes so much sense because, like, that's often what addiction is rooted in. Addiction is often, but not always, rooted in sort of the being overcome by emotions that we can't seem to rid ourselves of, whether that's grief or anger or fear or all of the above, or something totally different. It's often about this grip that emotions have on us that is so painful that we can't see another way to free ourselves from it. And so we turn towards something that helps us escape for a time being. And in that escape, we often end up harming ourselves, and it sort of perpetuates that cycle, and we fall into that just cyclical pattern. And it's really hard. We don't live in a society that supports people who are struggling with addiction, particularly, at least not here in the States. And in fact, addiction is really profitable. And I was listening to a podcast today that I'll drop below that mentions that specifically, and how especially exploitative capitalistic culture banks on us being unwell. It banks on us being under-resourced and unhappy in order to make a profit off of us. And so it's really an incredible feat for anyone to break free from addiction, and especially so for people who don't have ample resources to support them in doing that, and ample community to support them in doing that. And so I just want to give like a big hug to anyone who who is struggling with addiction or has struggled with addiction, there's so much shaming and like stigma that goes into it, and it's perhaps one of the most human responses to suffering. And I hope that if that's something that's close to your heart, whether it's for you or for people in your life who you love, that you're able to access gentleness. Gentleness and compassion are the only sustainable path that I've found out from addictive behaviors without ample resources. Being able to foster softness and kindness and self-compassion has been the antidote to that grip in all forms, in all senses, like whether it's attachments to people or to substances or to behaviors or screens or whatever. That softness has been critical, as has the self-discipline that I've cultivated, but that came later. That did not come first. It was punitive if I tried to go toward self-discipline without compassion. It ended up being rigid and like militaristic and very confining and restrictive as opposed to expansive. And so that plus loving connection has been the balm for me, and I suspect could be the balm for many other people. The other oracle card that I pulled was connection, and I thought that was really sweet alongside these messages around attachment, because then it also emphasizes that like connection is essential and we need people in order to heal. And I posted something the other day about that, how like we're not meant to heal alone, we're meant to heal in community. And often the shame, especially for folks who are marginalized or who have experienced like any type of othering, there can be this maybe like this survival response to like hide away when you're struggling, and to retreat and to try to like take care of yourself as opposed to going toward people, because we might feel shame, we might feel guilt, we might feel fear of being rejected or judged. And unfortunately, that does often happen. But what can also happen is that connection can hold us gently and can show us the kind of softness that we are trying to cultivate for ourselves. And when we receive compassion and care from someone, when we're not giving it to ourselves, it can kind of break our hearts open in a healing way. And so this card is about like the threads of connection that unite people, and often the synchronistic connections where we just know that a relationship is meaningful. And it can be scary when you are connecting with someone and you feel like the depth of something and you feel that like thread of love and resonance that's connecting you. I have a tendency at times to kind of like pull away when someone like likes me and or when someone is like being caring and thoughtful. I can have a response where I like bristle at times because there's a part of me that's still a little bit afraid of that. And that's something that like has swum around me for the past couple months, and I noticed it come up today, and then I like was able to be present with it and be like, no, this is actually like exactly what I ask for all the time, is sweetness and connection and adoration. And when I receive it, I want to be able to receive it. And the part of me that is afraid of receiving it is the part of me that feels really alone and that thinks that I need to do it myself, and that thinks that I'm undeserving or not enough, or fill in the blank with some belief. So it was really cool to be able to kind of experience the nuance of the devil in different ways, both in terms of like healing stuff around attachment and addiction and cultivating self-compassion, and then also the reminder that we don't do this alone. Like this is done in connection, this is done in community. And learning to trust people again is a big thing for me too. And a big thing for a lot of abuse survivors is learning to trust. And it's something that for really the first time in my life I feel is within reach. Like, I know now that I can trust people. Not everyone. I'm still like a fixed bitch. I've still got my stuff and I'm still like, discerning. But like the people I can trust, I know I can trust. And there's that felt sense of safety in those connections. And that's really powerful and really healing to be able to trust anyone in this life is very healing. So I will leave you with my song of the day. And I keep forgetting what my song of the day is until. Okay. I was just talking and not realizing it stopped recording when I opened Spotify. So my song of the day is Lose Control by Amaria. And, or it might be Amaria. And I love this song, and it's also so perfect for the devil, which is about control often and about like, that gripping, grasping quality that we might experience in life and over ourselves. And so a song about losing control on Devil Day, so lovely. And I will link it. It's kind of a sexy song, and it's about like desiring someone and losing control. And I will link the music video down below as usual. And then we also had this little exercise to go to YouTube and type in our name and then scroll down to a particular video. And the video that I got was about, or it was a music video, and it was this woman singing about how like her family had fallen apart and she, I think, became a single mother, and like the husband either like left or the relationship ended somehow. And it brought me back to the childhood stuff that I was talking about, and that experience of like what I often felt from my mom was a combination of her trying to kind of maintain an illusion of everything being okay to keep us safe, but then simultaneously, like it was so clear to me, I was a sensitive kid and I was pretty tuned in. It was so clear to me that things were not okay. And so it served this dual purpose. Like on the one hand, there were so many benefits because I didn't have to face a lot of the shit that was going down, and I was able to have some level of pleasant ignorance. And it was complicated because then there was this dissonance between what I knew I was experiencing and what I knew she was experiencing and what I was being told. And so that led to some self-distrust and to a deep, deep aversion for people maintaining facades. Something I can't deal with is when something is clearly amiss and people just can't name it. That's like a huge, huge challenge for me in relationships, is like I can't maintain a guise. I hate it. I really, really hate it. And so when there's this urge, which is very kind of Libran too, this urge to maintain harmony at the cost of truth is not it for me. And that is something that like I've been pretty black and white about for a long time. And I've come to appreciate the way that Libra energy can like offer diplomacy and seek harmony and compromise. But because it's this Libra South Node eclipse, it's just top of mind for me too that like guys is not supportive of community. What is supportive of community and connection is reciprocity and respect. And we can be honest and respectful. We can live in reciprocity and also be self-honoring and not self-abandon in the process of being in connection. And so all of those themes coming up big time as I'm thinking about like codependency. And it's something that actually Erin Kelly, who's a wonderful astrologer and peer of mine who went through the EA immersion program led by Amanda Moreno. I was on Erin Kelly's podcast recently, and she spoke a little bit about her own experiences with codependency and how like so much was shifting for her. And part of that was after a reading that we had that I'd done with her where we explored those themes, and she talks about it a little bit. But just another thing that I'm just remembering right now that was also cool. And we both kind of talked about experiences of like self-abandonment in that episode and journeys with healing. So I'll link that down below in the show notes too, in case you want to give that a listen. I thought it was a really lovely conversation, and I loved being a guest on Erin's podcast. It's also just a fucking amazing podcast. Like, Erin's an incredible host and has really beautiful conversations, including the one after our episode, which was with Amanda. So I definitely recommend checking those out if you're interested in following Erin and following Amanda. And being kind to yourself, being sweet to yourself, and gentle, and giving yourself the distance that you need from relationships in order to keep loving people while also loving yourself. There's this quote that I do not know the source of, but it's like, boundaries help me love you and me at the same time. And it's so true. Like, it's very hard to love someone when you're enmeshed with them. It's very hard to love someone when your well-being has to suffer in order to love them. And it depletes us, and it depletes other people. And developing and cultivating healthier boundaries and a stronger sense of self and respect for my own needs allows me to respect other people's needs and boundaries too. So, beautiful message from the devil. Thank you, devil. You have done good work today. All right, y'all. Have a lovely full moon. And I guess I'll mention that I'm also offering eclipse flash readings through this week only. And you can find them in my link tree. You can get an recorded astrology reading, just a little short one, like a little 10-minute one, focused on the themes of your eclipse window and also the sort of echoing outward themes of the next 6 months, because eclipses have kind of a big window of impact. And you can add a little mini bonus tarot pull to get guided or more insight and more guidance on how to support yourself through this eclipse window. So if you're interested in that, you can find the link in my link tree, which is in the show notes. And if you're not on my newsletter already, you should do that. It's also in my link tree. And that is all I have to say, okay? It's time for bed. I love you. Good night.